Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend some time with Saving the Appearances, a study in idolatry, a work of nonfiction by Owen Barfield that was originally published back in 1957. So, why I read this book, I love books about sort of the philosophy of consciousness, and Owen Barfield has been referenced in a number of books that I've read over the last few years. And most recently, actually, in Dante's Divine Comedy, A Guide for the Spiritual Journey by Mark Vernon, which I have finished and we'll have a chat on coming up before too long. But yeah, I just find Owen Barfield's ideas, really interesting. I previously read another of his books called History in English Words, which describes how we can see evidence of the evolution of our consciousness through the history of words and how the meanings of words have shifted through time. And that book was really fascinating. I will link to that chat down below. But back to Saving the Appearances, a study in idolatry. This was not necessarily an easy read. He says in the book, I shall have succeeded very poorly with the opening chapters of this book if I have not succeeded in making one thing plain. It is only necessary to take the first feeble step towards a renewal of participation. That is, the bare acknowledgement in beta thinking that phenomena are collective representations. In order to see that the actual evolution of the earth we know must have been at the same time an evolution of consciousness. So what does all that mean? Well, that actually was the challenge of reading this book and understanding that paragraph, actually. So I think that to understand, or maybe to explain in this chat, just these basic concepts that I took away from reading this book, we'll just kind of pick apart that paragraph, starting with the idea of what is a collective representation that is mentioned in that paragraph. And the example that he gives first in the book is that of a rainbow. So let's say that you and I are out, on a walk on a rainy day, and we see a rainbow. We both see this rainbow. Now, we know that the rainbow itself is composed of raindrops, and these little drops, we can call these raindrops particles. The particles of this object is raindrops, right? So whether or not the rainbow actually exists or not, to us, from our perspective, we see it as a rainbow, not a bunch of raindrops in the sky reflecting the sun's light. So in this sense, the rainbow is a collective representation. Collective meaning you and I see the rainbow and we agree that it's a rainbow. So what is he talking about as far as beta thinking? Because he says the bare acknowledgement in beta thinking that phenomena are collective representations. So beta thinking, we've established what the collective representation is. Barfield says there's three ways of thinking about these collective representations. The first way is contemplative, or experience them. He calls this method of thinking figurative. And this is like viewing a work of art. And in the book, he actually references a story from the artist Whistler, where a woman sees one of his paintings and she comments to the artist that she didn't see the world that way. And Whistler is supposed to have responded back to her, but don't you wish you could? Meaning, they're seeing this nature, or they're seeing the world in sort of a different way, this contemplative way. And then the second way of thinking about collective representations are theorizing and theoretical thinking, which is kind of what is basically scientific thinking. He calls this kind of thinking alpha thinking. And he argues in this book that alpha thinking is what has come to dominate Western Western civilization, and dominates our consciousness to the point that we have seen it as the only truth or as the only way of thinking, this sort of alpha thinking. But then there's this third way of thinking, which he's promoting here in this paragraph, and that is beta thinking. This is reflection is sort of philosophic type of thinking. So what is he talking, though, about participation? So participation is, Owen Barfield says that originally with humans, our consciousness experienced the world through what he calls original participation. And this describes our origins, right? Where we lived in a world that we were not disconnected from. Our consciousness, we didn't perceive ourselves disconnected from objects around us. Whereas today, our default is that we do think of ourselves as separated from everything around us. And so therefore, it's very difficult for us to think about and put ourselves into the place of a person in original participation. So for example, back to the rainbow, we see that rainbow as something outside of us and doesn't have anything to do with us. A person in original participation would have seen the rainbow. It would have been immersed in a different meaning. It would have been immersed in meaning for that person. But that's not to say that we can't participate in collective representations today. We do it, and to some degree, but we really have been separated. Our consciousness has become separated from the world around us now that we have come to be dominated by alpha thinking. But as recently as like the Middle Ages, the medieval period, there was still participation significantly more than what we have now. To talk about that, though, I think, participation, we need to talk actually about the title of the book, Saving the Appearances, A Study in Idolatry. So, appearances here are phenomena. So back to the quote where he says, "It is only necessary to take the first feeble step towards a renewal of participation, that is, the bare acknowledgement in beta thinking, this sort of philosophic thinking, that phenomena, saving the appearances, are collective representations. They're not true. So they're not the only truth. So saving the appearances means explaining the phenomena." So this phrase has been around in English for a long time. Saving the appearances means explaining the phenomena. So from what I gathered from the book. So explaining the phenomena. So in case of astronomy, saving the appearances would be explaining the movements of the planets. So for centuries, the Ptolemaic system saved the appearances. It explained everything, right? Remember, an appearance is a representation. It's a phenomenon. So what does the subtitle of A Study in Idolatry, though, mean here? So it's another thing I had to figure out from reading this book, because it's not what we usually think of as idolatry, because we usually think of idolatry in religious terms, or at least I do. Idolatry meaning some sort of substitute for a divine, like a substituting an object for a divine. So he goes on to say, "But a representation which is collectively mistaken for an ultimate ought not to be called a representation. It is an idol. Thus, the phenomena themselves are idols, when they are imagined as enjoying that independence of human perception which can in fact only pertain to the unrepresented." So I should have mentioned earlier, the represented, I talked about what was represented, the particles, the rainbow is the representation. The unrepresented would be the particles. So I think maybe the way I understand it is like from a tree is a representation. It's a collective representation. It's composed of particles, the unrepresented. But a modern person typically sees this tree as an object without much meaning. It exists outside of us, and it doesn't have much meaning, unto us, to ourselves. But there is much meaning within a tree that a person can recognize. Physical, symbolic, metaphoric, spiritual, do sort engaging with trees in that way and all those multiple ways, to me, is what he's meaning by participation. So I mentioned earlier original participation. So Barfield here says he's not arguing for us to try to go back to the original participation, because this would not be possible, because we have a different consciousness today than we did in the past. And so he nevertheless feels that we can sort of infuse our world with meaning by participation. I think is what I took away from that. All right, finally, before I run out of time, I just wanted to say something about words again, because I mentioned earlier that I read a book called History of English Words. He does talk about the history of words here as well and how they change. And so to me, this was also an example of how a person could practice more participation, and that is to engage with words in a different way. So modern humans, I think today, at least modern Western people, typically disassociate words from the word is just a symbol of something. It doesn't contain anything like actual there. But that's not how we used to see words, as like being an actual thing. So when you spoke a word, it had a greater meaning. It had a deeper meaning. And I think you can maybe see vestiges of this sometimes when, there's kind of like a joke when someone doesn't want to say the word cancer very loud, so they'll like whisper, like cancer, because that word has power. And so saying that word actually puts that energy, actually engages with that energy. And so anyway, being aware of that, not just words like cancer, but all words actually have a deeper, there's an ability there to deeper participate in words. And when you do that, you would participate more deeply with the world around you. At least that's what I took away from the book. Okay, I think I'll close with that. As I mentioned, this was not an easy book to read, but I did find it very enriching, and I'm glad that I read it. My next chat is actually going to be The Greater Trumps by Charles Williams, some esoteric fantasy, and I will have a chat on this coming up soon. Until next time, take care.